The wind that night carried a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the groan of old wood. It was something else, something that scraped along the spine and made the hair on your arms stand up. Jedediah Crowther heard it over the tired steps of his horse, a faint, rhythmic clinking from the heart of the ghost town. He wasn't supposed to be here. His trail had veered off course, pulled by a current he couldn't see. Now, under a sky full of cold, distant stars, he swung down from his saddle. The town was a collection of skeletons, houses leaning on each other, their windows like vacant eyes. The air smelled of dust and sagebrush, but underneath it all, there was another scent. Faint, metallic, like old blood and damp earth. Jed walked slow, his boots crunching on the dry, forgotten street. He was a big man, carved from mountain winters and a loneliness so deep it had become a part of him. He listened. The wind whispered through broken panes of glass, a lonely sound. But then he heard it again. Clink. Clink. Not wood, not stone. It was the sound of iron, the sound of chains. His hand went to the knife on his belt. He moved toward the largest building, an old ranch house that stood taller and darker than the rest. The porch groaned under his weight, every board complaining. He pushed the door, and it swung open into a room thick with dust and silence. He almost turned back. The place felt dead, hollowed out. But the sound came again, clearer this time. It was coming from below his feet. There was a door in the kitchen floor. A trap door. It was chained but not locked. Like someone had wanted to hide what was down there, but hadn't cared enough to truly secure it. Jed pulled the iron ring, and the hinges screamed like something wounded. A wave of stale air washed over him. It smelled of mildew, wet dirt, and something else. Something human. He lit the lantern from his saddlebag and started down the narrow steps, his broad shoulders brushing against the damp stone walls. The lantern light cut a shaky circle in the darkness. And that's when he saw her. She was huddled against the far wall, a ghost in the flickering light. Her wrists were locked in iron cuffs, the chains bolted directly into the stone. She was rail thin, her dress torn, her face hidden by a curtain of tangled hair. When the light hit her, she flinched, pressing herself against the wall as if trying to merge with it. Jed froze. He'd seen his share of cruelty in the war, in the wild places he called home. But this was different. This was a secret buried alive, a soul left to rot in the dark. He lowered the lantern, softening the glare. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I mean you no harm." She looked up. Her eyes were wide, a feverish blue in a face smudged with dirt and tears. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. Then, finally, she managed a few words, a plea that hit him harder than any punch. "Don't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't touch me." He had expected her to beg for freedom. He had expected her to scream or cry. He had not expected her to believe that he was just the next man in line to hurt her. He set the lantern on the dirt floor and held up his empty hands, palms out, a gesture of peace. "No touching," he promised, his voice softer than he knew it could be. "Only helping." Her eyes darted from his face to the chains and back again, searching for the lie. He moved slowly, deliberately. He pulled his hunting knife, but the chain was too thick. It wouldn't break. He put the knife away and set his jaw. He wrapped one huge hand around the iron bolt, driven into the wall, and planted his feet. With a grunt, he pulled. His muscles screamed, veins standing out on his arms. The stone groaned in protest. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a tree cracking in half, the bolt ripped free from the wall. The chain crashed to the ground. The noise echoed in the small cellar, the sound of freedom. She stared at the broken chain, then at her own wrists, as if she couldn't believe they were no longer bound to the wall. Disbelief trembled on her lips. He knelt
knelt a few feet away, giving her space. "Can you walk?" he asked. "If not, I'll carry you. It's your choice." She shook her head, a slow, terrified motion. "They'll come back," she rasped. "Who?" His voice was hard now, cold as the stone around them. "The men, they left me here, said I wasn't worth the food anymore." Her voice broke on a sob she tried to swallow. "They said if anyone found me, it would be to finish what they started." Jed's hand clenched into a fist. He looked at her, really looked, past the grime and the bruises. She was young, barely a woman. She should have been living a life full of light, not chained in a cellar waiting for death.
He thought of his wife, buried under a pile of rocks on a lonely hill, and the silence that had eaten him alive ever since. He couldn't leave her to the mercy of this town. They would see her wounds, her torn dress, and they would judge her. They would whisper, and their whispers would be another kind of chain. He took off his heavy canvas coat and laid it on the ground between them. "Put this on," he said. "We'll walk out of here together." Her hands were shaking as she reached for it. The coat swallowed her, the sleeves hanging past her fingers, the hem dragging in the dirt. She tried to stand, her legs wobbling like a newborn foal's. He fought the instinct to reach out and steady her. He had made a promise. She saw the restraint in his eyes, and for the first time, a tiny flicker of trust sparked in her gaze. Together, they climbed the steps out of the darkness. When the cool night air hit her face, she gasped, a deep, shuddering breath, as if she hadn't truly breathed in years. She tilted her head back, letting the starlight wash over her closed eyes. Jed led her to the porch and built a small fire. In the warm glow, he could see the hollows of her cheeks, the haunted look in her eyes that made her seem both ancient and terribly young. He gave her water, which she drank like a woman dying of thirst. He heated some beans, but she could only manage a few bites before pushing the bowl away. "It'll just come back up," she whispered, shame coloring her voice. He didn't press her. They sat in silence, watching the flames dance. "What's your name?" he finally asked. She hesitated, then spoke it so softly he almost missed it. "Liebeth." "Liebeth," he repeated, the name feeling solid in the quiet night. He stared into the fire. "You'll not hear that name spoken in cruelty again. Not while I have breath in my body." Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You don't know," she whispered, looking out at the dark shapes of the ruined town. "If I go back, they'll all look at me. They'll see what I've been. No man wants—" Her voice caught. "No man wants a broken woman." The words hit him like a physical blow. He knew that feeling. The feeling of being shattered beyond repair. He'd felt it every day since he'd lost his wife. "Broken?" he said, his voice low and rough. "The mountain breaks under the weight of the snow, but it's still standing when spring comes. You're still here, girl. That's not broken. That's living." A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. Living isn't the same as being worth keeping. He knew he had to do something more than just cutting her chains. He had to give her a shield, a wall to stand behind while she healed. An idea formed in his mind, wild and drastic, but it felt right. It felt like the only thing to do. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't let them see me like this. They'll never forgive me for what was done to me." Jed stood up, his tall frame a silhouette against the rising sun. He looked down at the fragile woman huddled in his coat, and the decision settled in his soul, heavy and absolute. He had freed her from the iron, but the chains of shame were far stronger. He wouldn't let this world break her again. He held out his hand, not to touch her, but as an offer. "Then we won't give them the chance," he said, his voice quiet but unshakable. His eyes met hers. Before this day is done, you'll be my wife." The words dropped into the quiet morning like a stone into a still pond. Libeth stared at him, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a terror so profound it stole her breath. Wife? The word was alien. She had been a prisoner, a victim, a thing left to die. The idea of being a wife was from another lifetime, a world she could no longer imagine belonging to. The fire popped and hissed between them, casting flickering shadows on his rugged face. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't threatening. He was simply stating a fact, as if he were predicting the weather. This wasn't a proposal born of love or even affection. It was something else. A shield. A fortress. But fortresses could also be prisons. As the sun climbed higher, they walked into the nearby town. Jed strode with purpose, Libeth shuffling beside him, wrapped in his coat, her bare feet raw against the dusty road. The town was waking up, and with it, the whispers began. Curtains twitched in windows, doors creaked open, eyes followed them, sharp and judging. The gossip spread like a disease, a quiet hum of speculation and condemnation. By the time they reached the small wooden church on the edge of town, it felt like every single person was staring at them. Jed ignored them all, his focus singular. He pushed open the chapel doors. Inside, Pastor Amos, a man with a face as weathered as an old Bible, looked up from the altar. His brow furrowed at the sight of them, the grim mountain man and the broken girl swimming in his coat. "Jedediah Crowther," the pastor said, his voice laced with suspicion. "It's been a long time. What trouble have you brought to my door?" Jed didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I bring her freedom," he stated, his voice echoing slightly in the empty church. "And I'm here to make her my wife." A woman who had been praying in a back pew gasped audibly. The pastor's eyes widened. He looked from Jed to Libeth, taking in her matted hair, her torn dress, the haunted emptiness in her eyes. "Marriage is a holy sacrament, Jedediah. It's not a bandage for a bad reputation." "It's a covenant of dignity," Jed shot back, his gaze unwavering. "And that's all I mean for her to have." Libeth stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt the weight of every eye, every unspoken judgment. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the darkness where at least the cruelty was simple and direct. The whispers started again, quiet but sharp. Ruined. Tainted. She ducked her head, trying to hide, but Jed turned, his gaze sweeping over the few onlookers. "There will be no ill words spoken of her in this house," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a coming storm. The church fell silent. Pastor Amos let out a long, weary sigh. He looked at Libeth again, and for a moment, the judgment in his eyes softened into something that looked like pity. He saw not a sinner, but a survivor. He gave a reluctant nod. "Then let us begin." The vows felt like a dream, a strange, surreal play she was watching from a great distance. Jed's voice was a steady baritone, his answers firm and clear. Then it was her turn. The pastor looked at her, his expression expectant. The words caught in her throat. The church walls seemed to press in, the air growing thick and heavy. She could feel the cold iron of the cuffs on her wrists again, smell the damp earth of the cellar. This vow, this promise, it was another kind of chain, another bolt in the wall. Panic seized her. Jed leaned in, his voice a low whisper meant only for her. "No one decides for you, Libeth. Not them, not me. Only you." She looked up at him. In his eyes she didn't see a captor or a master. She saw a man who was offering her a choice. A man who was waiting, patiently, for her to decide her own fate. A single word escaped her lips, cracked and quiet, but it filled the entire church. "Yes." Pastor Amos raised his hand and declared them man and wife. Jed didn't kiss her. He simply gave a solemn nod, as if the words themselves were all that mattered. When they stepped back outside, A crowd had gathered. The whispers were gone, replaced by hard, unforgiving stares. A woman hissed, "Fool's bride!" Another man spat into the dust near her feet. Libeth flinched, the old shame washing over her, threatening to pull her under. But then Jed did something unexpected. He reached down and took her hand, lifting it for everyone to see. He didn't grip it possessively. He held it up as if it were a trophy, a declaration. The gesture sent a ripple through the crowd. This wasn't a man hiding his shame. This was a man showing his pride. A few faces in the crowd softened. The whispers died down. In the center of it all, Libeth stood a little taller, her breath coming a little easier. Jed leaned close again. "Chains bind the body," he murmured. "Shame binds the soul. Today, you broke both." Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, they weren't tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of release. She didn't know this man. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But as she walked with him through the silent, staring crowd, she felt something she hadn't felt in a lifetime. She felt the first, fragile glint of hope. But what she didn't know was that their marriage hadn't ended her problems. It had just announced them to the world. And the world was listening. The town marshal was waiting for them at the end of the street. His name was Silas Kane, a man with eyes as gray and hard as river stones. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, a silver star pinned to his vest, watching them approach with an unreadable expression. "Crowther," he said, his voice flat. That was quite the spectacle. "It was a wedding, Marshal," Jed replied, his tone equally level. Silas's eyes flickered to Libeth, who instinctively shrank behind Jed's broad frame. "Is that what it was? Looked more like you were claiming salvage." The insult was sharp, meant to provoke. Jed's hand tightened on Libeth's, but his voice remained calm. "This is my wife. Her name is Libeth Crowther. We'll be heading up to my cabin." Silas didn't move. He tilted his head, studying Jed. "Funny thing. A man like you, keeping to yourself for all these years after your first wife passed. Then you ride out of a ghost town with a half-starved girl and marry her before the sun is even high in the sky. It's a story that makes a man ask questions." "Then ask them," Jed said, his patience wearing thin. "All right, I will," Silas said, taking a step closer. The friendly tone was gone, replaced by cold authority. "Where'd you find her? Who did this to her? What aren't you telling me, Jedediah?" Libeth's breath hitched. She could hear the men's voices in her head, their cruel laughter. She didn't want to talk about them. She couldn't. Jed spoke for her. "I found her chained in a cellar. The men who did it were long gone. That's the whole story." Silas grunted, unconvinced. "So you didn't see them? Didn't get a look at their faces? Their horses? Nothing?" "Nothing," Jed lied. In truth, he'd seen fresh tracks leading away from the ghost town, heading east. But telling the law would involve Libeth in a long, painful process. He had chosen to handle this himself. "I see," Silas said, though his eyes said he saw a liar. He looked past Jed to Libeth, his gaze sharp and piercing. "Ma'am, is that how it happened?" Libeth couldn't speak. She just nodded, her face buried in Jed's back. Silas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, Crowther, take your wife home. But don't think this is over. I'll be riding out to that ranch house myself. And if I find anything that contradicts your story, I'll be paying you a visit." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "You brought a storm to this town today. I just hope you're prepared for the rain." With a final lingering look at Libeth, the marshal turned and walked away. The journey to Jed's cabin was long and silent. It was nestled high in the mountains, far from any prying eyes, a small, sturdy structure built of rough-hewn logs. Inside, it was clean and sparse. A fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed. Jed gave her a spare set of his first wife's clothes. They were simple and worn, but clean. While she changed behind a makeshift screen, he started a fire in the hearth. The warmth began to chase away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. When she stepped out, she felt like a different person. The clothes were too big, but they were whole. They didn't carry the stench of fear and despair. For the first time, Jed saw the woman beneath the victim. Her hair, though still tangled, was the color of dark honey, and her eyes, free from the immediate terror, held a deep, quiet intelligence. His breath caught in his throat. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace was a small, hand-carved portrait of his first wife, Sarah. Libeth was standing near it, her head tilted, and the resemblance was jarring. They had the same eyes, the same high cheekbones. It was like looking at a ghost. Libeth noticed him staring. She followed his gaze to the portrait, then back to his face. "Your first wife?" she asked softly. Jed could only nod, his throat suddenly tight. The similarity wasn't just passing. It was deep, familial. It was impossible. "She was beautiful," Libeth said, her voice full of a strange sadness. She reached out a hesitant finger and traced the carved cheekbone. "What was her name?" "Sarah," Jed managed to say. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. She died a few years back. Sickness took her." It was another lie, and as soon as he said it, he saw a flicker of something in Libeth's eyes. It wasn't suspicion. It was recognition. "Did it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She looked from the portrait to him, a question forming on her lips, a question that terrified him. "Or did the same men who took me take her too?" The question hung in the small cabin, heavier than the silence that followed. Jed felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. How could she possibly know that? He had told no one the truth about Sarah's death. To the town, it was a winter fever. But he knew better. He had found the tracks, the signs of a struggle. She hadn't died peacefully in her bed. She had been taken. He stared at Libeth, his mind racing. Was this a coincidence? Or was there a connection between this strange girl and his dead wife that ran deeper than a chance resemblance? "How did you know to ask that?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Libeth's eyes filled with tears. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection he was beginning to recognize. "Because they talked," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The men in the cellar. They would drink and they would boast. They talked about all the others they'd taken. And they mentioned a name, over and over. Sarah." Jed felt the blood drain from his face. For years he had lived with the private grief, the secret knowledge of his wife's violent end. He had hunted for those men, but the trail had gone cold. He had resigned himself to a life of quiet, lonely vengeance. Now, this girl, this stranger he had married out of a sense of duty, had just ripped open the wound he thought had scarred over. "They told you about her?" he pressed, taking a step closer. "What did they say?" "They said she was stubborn," Libeth said, her gaze fixed on the wooden portrait. "They said they were looking for something, a map, but she wouldn't tell them where it was. They said she fought back, and they punished her for it." A map. The word sent a jolt through Jed. He remembered Sarah spending weeks before she was taken, poring over old county surveys and her father's journals. She'd been searching for something she called her family's legacy. She had claimed her grandfather had discovered a rich silver vein in the mountains, but the location had been lost. He had dismissed it as a fanciful story. Now, it seemed, her story had gotten her killed. "And what about you?" Jed asked, his mind reeling. "Why did they take you?" Libeth shook her head, confusion clouding her face. I don't know. I was just passing through, on my way to start a new life. They ambushed my wagon. They kept asking me questions I didn't understand. About my family. About my name. A cold dread began to creep up Jed's spine. Your name? What about your name? My full name, she clarified. Libeth Carver. They kept repeating it. Carver. They seemed to think it meant something. Jed's heart stopped. Carver. That was Sarah's maiden name. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern. They hadn't taken two random women. They had taken Sarah Carver. And now they had taken her relative, Libeth Carver. He looked at Libeth, at the eyes so similar to his dead wife's, and the terrible truth crashed down on him. You're related, he said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. You and Sarah. Your family. Libeth looked stunned. I don't know. My parents died when I was young. I never knew my extended family. But Jed knew. The resemblance, the name, the map, it all clicked into place. These men weren't random bandits. They were hunters, and they were hunting the Carver family, looking for a lost silver mine. They had killed his wife for it, and they had nearly killed her cousin. He had married the one person on Earth who was tangled in the same web that had killed his wife. He had thought he was protecting a stranger. Instead, he had just painted a target on the back of the only living link to Sarah's murder, and he had brought that target right into his home. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary moments before, now felt like a trap. Meanwhile, miles away, Marshal Silas Kane was kneeling in the dirt floor of the same cellar where Jed had found Libeth. His lantern cast long dancing shadows on the stone walls. He ran a gloved finger over the spot where the bolt had been ripped out. Crowther was strong, but this was the work of a man possessed. He scanned the floor, his eyes sharp and practiced. He wasn't looking for signs of a struggle. He was looking for what had been left behind. In the far corner, half buried in the dirt, something glinted. Silas dug it out with the tip of his knife. It was a small, ornate silver button, tarnished with age. It wasn't the kind of thing a drifter or a bandit would have on their coat. It was detailed, expensive. The crest on it was unmistakable. A stylized W intertwined with a mountain peak. The crest of the Wentworth family. Silas stood up, a grim expression on his face. Old Man Wentworth was the founder of the town, its wealthiest and most respected citizen. He owned the bank, the general store, half the land in the county. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose reputation was as solid as the gold in his vault. And his family crest was in a cellar where a young woman had been tortured. The marshal's mind went back to his conversation with Jed. The man's story had felt thin, full of holes. Now he understood why. Jed wasn't lying to protect the girl. He was lying because he knew who was behind this, and he knew the law was powerless against a man like Wentworth. Or worse, the law was in his pocket. Silas pocketed the button. This wasn't a simple case of kidnapping anymore. This was a conspiracy that went to the very heart of their town. He had to tread carefully. Questioning Wentworth directly was impossible. He needed more proof. He thought of Jed and the girl, holed up in that mountain cabin. He had warned Crowther that he'd brought a storm. He was beginning to suspect that Jed knew it all along. He wasn't just running from a storm, he was preparing for a war. And Silas had to decide which side he was on. Back at the cabin, the revelation that Libeth was Sarah's cousin had changed everything. The air was thick with unspoken grief and a new, shared sense of danger. Jed felt a crushing weight of responsibility. He had failed to protect Sarah. He would not fail Libeth. He began to fortify the cabin, barring the windows and reinforcing the door. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was no longer just a grieving widower. He was a guardian. Libeth watched him, her fear slowly being replaced by a quiet resolve. Learning about her connection to Sarah had given her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. She wasn't just a random victim. She was part of a story, a bloody and tragic one, but a story nonetheless. And she was determined to see how it ended. She started to explore the small cabin, her new home. It was filled with the ghost of Sarah. Her worn books on a shelf, a half-finished piece of knitting in a basket, and the carved portrait that looked so much like her own reflection. In a small wooden chest at the foot of the bed, she found Sarah's belongings. Among them was a small, leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with Sarah's elegant script. She wrote of her love for Jed, her dreams for their life in the mountains. But as Libeth read on, the tone of the journal began to change. It became filled with frantic, obsessive entries about her family's past. She wrote about the Carver silver mine, the lost legacy she was trying to reclaim. She wrote about her suspicions of the powerful Wentworth family, who had bought up all the surrounding land for suspiciously low prices decades ago, right after her grandfather had mysteriously disappeared. And then, in the final entry, dated the day before she was taken, Libeth found what the men had been looking for. "I've found it," Sarah had written. "It's not a map on paper. It's a map of memory. My grandfather hid the directions in a nursery rhyme he taught my father, who taught it to me. The words are the key. The silver sleeps where the weeping willow cries into the eagle's nest." Libeth's heart pounded. It was a riddle. A children's rhyme that held the key to a fortune. This was the secret Sarah had died to protect. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked on the porch outside. Jed, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, froze. He looked at Libeth, his eyes wide, and put a single finger to his lips. He moved silently to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. A low voice murmured outside, followed by the crunch of boots. It wasn't one person. It was several. They were here. The men from the cellar had found them. Jed grabbed his rifle and flattened himself against the wall beside the door. Libeth's mind raced. The riddle. The nursery rhyme. That was their only leverage. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a new feeling was taking root. Anger. She was tired of being a victim. She was tired of being hunted. The handle of the cabin door began to turn. The door burst open with a splintering crack. 3 men spilled into the room, their faces hardened by cruelty and greed. One of them, a big man with a scar running through his eyebrow, had a sadistic grin on his face when he saw Libeth. "Well, look what we have here," he snarled. "Little bird found herself a new cage." Jed didn't hesitate. He swung the butt of his rifle, catching the first man in the jaw with a sickening crunch. The man crumpled to the floor. The other 2 raised their pistols, but Jed was already moving, using the heavy wooden table as a shield, shoving it into them. The cabin erupted into chaos. Gunshots exploded, the sound deafening in the small space. Wood splintered from the walls. Libeth screamed and dove behind the bed, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. Jed was a force of nature. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered bear, a silent, deadly rage in his eyes. He disarmed one man, throwing him through a window, sending glass showering onto the porch. But the third man, the leader with the scar, was clever. He circled around, using the chaos to get a clear shot. He leveled his pistol at Jed's back. "Jed!" Libeth screamed. But before the man could pull the trigger, Libeth did the only thing she could think of. She yelled the words from Sarah's journal. "The silver sleeps where the weeping willow cries into the eagle's nest." The scarred man froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. His eyes swiveled from Jed to her, his greedy grin replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. "What did you say?" "That's the key," Libeth said, her voice shaking but clear. "I know where the map is. You kill him, and you'll never find it." It was a bluff. She didn't know what the riddle meant. Not yet. but it was the only card she had to play. The man stared at her, his mind working. The silver mine was the prize. Jed was just an obstacle. He slowly lowered his pistol. "You're a carver, all right," he sneered, "just as stubborn as the last one." At that moment, another figure appeared in the shattered doorway. It was Marshal Silas Kane, his gun drawn. "Drop it," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. The scarred man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He wasn't afraid. "You're a little late to the party, Marshal, and you're on the wrong side." Silas's face was grim. "There's only one side here, and it's the law's." "Is it?" the man mocked. "Why don't you ask your boss?" As if on cue, a fourth man stepped out from behind the trees. He was older, dressed in a fine suit, his silver hair immaculate. He carried himself with an air of untouchable power. It was Old Man Wentworth. "Excellent work, gentlemen," Wentworth said, his voice smooth as silk but cold as a grave. He looked at the chaos in the cabin with distaste, his eyes finally settling on Libeth. "So, this is the last of the Carvers. A pity. Your grandfather was a fool. He could have been a rich man. Instead, he chose a shallow grave." The truth hit Jed like a physical blow. Wentworth. He was behind it all. He had been hunting the Carvers for decades. Wentworth turned his cold eyes to the marshal. "Silas, arrest this man," he said, gesturing to Jed. "He's clearly unhinged, attacked my associates. And this poor girl, he obviously kidnapped her and filled her head with nonsense." Silas didn't move. His gun was still trained on the scarred man, but his eyes were locked on Wentworth. He held up the small silver button he'd found in the cellar. "Recognize this, Mr. Wentworth?" For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed Wentworth's calm facade. He recovered quickly. "It's a button. What of it?" "I found it in the cellar where your men kept this girl chained to a wall," Silas said, his voice hardening. "It seems your story has a few holes in it." Wentworth's polite mask finally dropped, revealing the ruthless predator beneath. "You foolish small-town lawman," he hissed. "You think that star on your chest gives you power? I own this town. I own you." "You don't own me," Silas said quietly. "And you don't own the law. Not today." It was a standoff. Jed and Silas against Wentworth and his hired guns. Libeth, huddled behind the bed, knew that this was the final act. Everything had been leading to this moment. Her gaze fell on Sarah's journal, lying open on the floor. The weeping willow. The eagle's nest. The words clicked in her mind. It wasn't a place. It was an object. Sarah's portrait. Jed had carved it himself from a piece of weeping willow. And etched into the corner, almost invisible, was a tiny carving of an eagle. The map wasn't in the journal. It was the frame. "The portrait," she whispered. Jed heard her. His eyes darted to the mantelpiece. He understood. Wentworth heard her too. "Get it," he commanded his man. But it was too late. The standoff broke. Jed launched himself toward the fireplace. The scarred man fired, the bullet grazing Jed's shoulder, but he didn't stop. He grabbed the heavy wooden frame and turned, using it as a shield and a weapon. Silas opened fire, providing cover. The cabin became a blur of motion and violence. But this time, it wasn't just Jed fighting for survival. It was a fight for justice. Libeth, seeing one of the thugs reloading near the window, grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth. With a cry that came from the very depths of her soul, a cry for Sarah, for her family, for herself, she swung. The poker connected with a brutal crack, and the man went down. She stood there, breathing heavily, the poker in her hand, no longer a victim. She was a carver, and she was fighting back. The fight was brutal and short. Faced with Jed's raw strength, Silas's steady aim, and Libeth's surprising ferocity, Wentworth's men were quickly overpowered. Wentworth himself, seeing the tide turn, tried to flee, but Silas tackled him to the ground. The old man lay in the dirt, his fine suit ruined, his power broken. He looked up at them, his eyes filled with a lifetime of frustrated greed and hatred. "You'll get nothing," he spat. "The land is mine. The deed is clear." Jed looked down at the portrait frame in his hands. He ran his thumb along the back and found a loose piece. He pried it open. Tucked inside was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It wasn't a map. It was the original deed to the mine, signed and dated 50 years ago, in the name of Libeth's grandfather. And with it, a signed confession from a young Wentworth, admitting to the murder and theft, which he was clearly forced to write, and Carver had hidden as insurance. It was all there, the proof, the justice Sarah had died for. Silas hauled Wentworth to his feet. "It's over," the marshal said, cuffing the old man's hands behind his back. "Your reign is over." As they led Wentworth and his men away, Jed and Libeth stood on the porch of the battered cabin, the morning sun casting a warm glow on their faces. The storm had passed. Jed looked at the wound on his shoulder, then at Libeth. "You were brave in there." "I learned from the best," she said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time. She looked at the deed in her hands, the legacy that had cost her family so much. "What now?" Jed looked out at the mountains, the same mountains that had witnessed his grief and loneliness for so long. They didn't seem so empty anymore. He looked at the woman beside him, this stranger who was his wife, his family. The marriage had been a shield, a lie to protect her. But somewhere in the chaos and the fighting, it had started to feel real. "Now," he said, his voice full of a hope he thought he'd lost forever. "We live." They rebuilt the cabin, stronger than before. The whispers in town died down, replaced by a grudging respect. Libeth, with her newfound wealth and strength, helped bring a new kind of justice to the town, one not ruled by fear or greed. The marriage, born of necessity, slowly blossomed into one of true partnership and affection. The ghosts of the past were not forgotten, but they no longer haunted the halls. Instead, they became a foundation, a reminder of the price of freedom and the strength it takes to claim it. Jedediah Crowther had ridden into a ghost town looking for nothing. But in the darkest corners, he found a chained woman, a lost legacy, and a reason to live again. He had saved her, but in the end, they had truly saved each other. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.